It started like any other afternoon at Murphy's gas station, the kind of place people stopped at when there was no other choice. Perched on the edge of a forgotten highway, Murphy's was more than just a pit stop. It was where road-weary drivers stretched their legs, topped off their gas tanks, and grabbed a bottle of water or a greasy bag of chips before moving on. The building itself had seen better days, the paint peeling off its walls, and the old neon sign buzzing faintly, as if struggling to stay alive. The afternoon sun hung low in the sky, hot and relentless, turning everything golden. Shadows stretched long and thin across the cracked pavement. A dry breeze swept across the parking lot, carrying dust and the faint smell of oil. Most people passed through quickly, the silence of the gas station broken only by the occasional slamming of a car door or the chime of the entrance bell. But that day, there was someone else at Murphy's. Someone who didn't seem in any hurry to leave. He sat quietly on the far side of the lot, near the rusted ice machine and the crooked vending machines that hadn't been stocked in years. A man. Older, maybe in his late 50s, with skin that had seen too many summers under a blazing sun. He was hunched on top of a worn-out duffel bag, his shoulders slumped as though the weight of life itself rested there. His beard was thick and unkempt, streaks of gray poking through like wisps of smoke, and his clothes looked like they had been worn for days, tattered and faded, stained with dust and time. A faded military cap sat low on his forehead, shading his eyes. The brim was frayed, as if the cap had been with him through storms and battles no one else could see. His boots, scuffed and cracked, rested flat against the ground, and his hands, large, strong, yet rough, rested lightly on his knees. From a distance, he looked like just another drifter. Invisible to the world, unnoticed and unimportant. Nobody spared him a second glance. Inside the gas station, Clara, the cashier, stood behind the counter, chewing a piece of gum and staring out the window. She was young, barely 19, and stuck working the summer shift at Murphy's while she saved up for college. Her phone buzzed on the counter, but she ignored it. Her eyes were fixed on the old man sitting outside. "He's been here for hours," she mumbled to herself. She couldn't help but feel bad for him. He didn't seem to be bothering anyone. Just sitting there, like he was waiting for something or someone that wasn't coming. Her thoughts were interrupted by a noise. A low rumble. The kind of sound that makes the ground vibrate beneath your feet. Motorcycles. Clara turned her head toward the window and frowned. Sure enough, coming up the highway were 4 black Harleys, each gleaming under the sun like predators on the prowl. They weren't moving fast, but the roar of their engines grew louder and louder, swallowing the quiet that had settled around the gas station. The bikes swerved into the parking lot and came to a stop with a screeching whine of brakes, gravel crunching under their tires. The riders dismounted in perfect sync, like a pack of wolves circling their territory. 4 men, all of them dressed in black leather jackets, their shoulders emblazoned with the snarling logo of a skull. Their boots hit the pavement with heavy thuds. Duke, the leader, stepped forward first. He was a towering man, built like a freight train, with tattoos snaking up his thick neck and disappearing into his beard. A cigarette hung from his lips, the smoke curling upward as he surveyed the lot. Behind him were Reggie, Mick, and Blaze, 3 men who followed Duke like shadows. Reggie, thin and wiry, wore sunglasses so dark you couldn't see his eyes. Mick was the loudest, his chain necklace clinking with every step, and Blaze, well, Blaze never said much, but his crooked grin made him look dangerous enough. Clara's stomach twisted. She'd seen them before. Everybody in town knew about the Steel Reapers, a local biker gang that liked to show up uninvited, especially at places like this. They were trouble. Always. As the bikers spread out across the lot, Duke cracked his knuckles loudly and glanced around. There was no one else at Murphy's, not another car in sight. Just the old man sitting quietly against the wall. Duke's lip curled into a smirk as he spotted him. Well, he drawled, tossing his cigarette onto the pavement and crushing it under his boot. What have we here? The old man didn't move. He didn't even look up. It was like he hadn't heard them at all. Duke's smile widened. He lived for moments like this. Moments where he could remind the world who was in charge. With slow, heavy steps, he approached the man and stopped just a few feet away. The other bikers followed close behind, snickering quietly, like hyenas waiting for the lion to strike. The gas station grew silent, except for the faint whistle of the wind and the creaking of the old ice machine. "What's a guy like you doing here?" Duke asked, his voice dripping with mockery. He tilted his head, pretending to be curious. "You lost, old man." Still, the man said nothing. He remained seated, his gaze fixed on the ground as if Duke and his gang didn't exist. Duke didn't like being ignored. "Hey," he said, sharper now. "I'm talking to you." The old man didn't flinch. He just sat there calm as still water. His hands rested motionless on his knees, but if you looked closely, you might have noticed his fingers curling slightly, as though testing the air. Reggie chuckled. "Guess he's deaf." "Or stupid," Mick added. The bikers laughed. Even Clara, still watching from inside, felt a chill go down her spine. She wanted to call anyone, but her hands felt frozen in place. Duke stepped closer, his boots stopping just inches from the man's duffel bag. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a fresh cigarette, lighting it with a flick of his silver lighter. He blew out a long stream of smoke, letting it drift downward, right in front of the man's face. "Listen, old-timer," Duke said. "I don't know what you're doing here, but this ain't the place for freeloaders. You're sittin' on private property, you know." He flicked his cigarette casually toward the man's bag. The burning tip landed just beside it, close enough to make the fabric smolder. Finally, the man moved. It was subtle, barely noticeable at first. His hands tightened slightly, his knuckles white against his skin. And for a split second, his eyes flickered upward, locking onto Duke's face. It was quick, so quick that Duke didn't even catch it, but anyone paying attention would have seen it. The bikers didn't notice. They were too busy laughing again, entertained by their own cruelty. But Clara saw it. From her spot behind the counter, she could see everything. And when she looked into the man's eyes for that brief moment, she saw something she couldn't quite explain. A look. A look that wasn't fearful, or desperate, or broken. No, it was something else. Calm. Focused. Unshakable. Clara swallowed hard. Whoever this man was, she knew one thing for sure. He was not what he seemed. And that's where the bikers made their first mistake. The laughter echoed through the parking lot, carried away by the wind. To the bikers, this was just another game, another helpless man to toy with, someone too weak or broken to fight back. Duke crouched down just a little, bringing himself closer to the man's face, his grin wide and mean. "You don't have anything to say, huh? Cat got your tongue?" Duke sneered. He waved his hand mockingly in front of the man's face. "You even awake under there?" Still nothing. The man's face remained turned down, the shadow from his cap hiding his expression. His hands, though, told a different story. They were steady, resting on his knees like he had all the time in the world. If you didn't know any better, you might have thought he was meditating. Mick, the loudest of the group, stepped forward, letting his chain necklace jingle loudly as he moved. "Duke, this guy's boring. Look at him, he's got nothing on him worth talking anyway. Bet his pockets are as empty as his head." Reggie snorted, his sunglasses slipping slightly down the bridge of his nose as he peered at the old man. "I say we send him packin'. He's ruining the view." The others chuckled, but Duke wasn't satisfied. No, Duke wanted more than laughter. He wanted to see fear. He wanted the old man to react, beg, stammer, or at least acknowledge him. Something about the man's quietness, his stillness, rubbed Duke the wrong way. "You're awful quiet, old-timer," Duke said, his voice dropping lower. "Makes me think you're hiding something. I don't like secrets." Duke stood up straight and turned to the others. "You know what? Maybe we'll check out what he's got. Make sure he's not carrying anything he shouldn't be." The gang cheered at this, an excitement in their voices that felt too sharp, too dangerous. They didn't care if the man had anything valuable, they just wanted to tear him down, piece by piece, for their own amusement. That's what bullies do. But as Duke took a step closer, Clara's voice rang out from the gas station doorway, shaky but clear. "Hey! You leave him alone." The bikers froze, their heads snapping toward the gas station like wolves spotting prey. Duke turned slowly, his lips curling into a sly grin. Clara stood there, fists clenched at her sides, her apron wrinkled and her face pale, but her eyes burning with a mix of fear and defiance. "And what are you gonna do about it, sweetheart?" Duke called, his voice oozing mockery. "Gonna call the sheriff? Go ahead. We'll be long gone before he shows up." Clara hesitated. He was right. Murphy's gas station was too far out of town, and the nearest sheriff was at least 30 minutes away. By the time help arrived, there'd be nothing left to fix. She glanced quickly at the old man again, hoping he would somehow rise to his feet or say anything to let her know he was okay. But he didn't. Instead, he remained exactly where he was, his head still bowed, his posture completely relaxed. Too relaxed. Clara swallowed hard. Something about this wasn't right. The man wasn't scared. He wasn't panicked. It was as if the bikers didn't exist to him at all. Duke's attention returned to the old man, his irritation growing. "Don't worry about her," he muttered to his gang. "She's just a kid. Let's see what our friend here's got." He kicked the duffel bag with his boot again, this time harder, sending it sliding a few feet across the pavement. The man didn't move. Didn't blink. Duke's grin faltered for just a second before he bent down and grabbed the bag by its strap. "Let's take a look inside, shall we?" Blaze, who hadn't said much, finally spoke up. His voice was low and gravelly, like he chewed on rocks. "Duke, maybe we should leave it alone." Duke glared at him. "What's your problem? It's just a bag." Blaze's eyes lingered on the old man, watching him closely. "I don't like this." Duke laughed, loud and exaggerated. "You don't like it? What are you, scared? The guy's just a bum. What's he gonna do, huh? Yell at us to get off his lawn?" The other bikers snickered again, but Blaze looked uneasy. He couldn't explain it, but there was something about the old man that put him on edge. Something in the air felt off, like the calm before a storm. Ignoring him, Duke unzipped the duffel bag with a loud rip. He reached inside, pulling out one item after another. First came the sleeping mat, tightly rolled and well-worn, like it had been carried across miles of open ground. Then there was a faded photograph, the corners bent, showing a younger version of the man standing proudly in a uniform with a group of soldiers. Duke barely glanced at it before tossing it onto the ground. "Pathetic," he muttered, fishing deeper into the bag. Reggie and Mick leaned closer, trying to get a good look, while Blaze stayed back, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. Clara watched from the doorway, her heart hammering in her chest. She wanted to scream at them to stop, to leave the man alone. But her voice felt stuck in her throat. And then it happened. Duke's hand froze. He pulled something from the bag, something small and metallic, and held it up to the sunlight. For a second, nobody said a word. They just stared. It was a military badge. The kind reserved for men of honor, for soldiers who had served their country with distinction. It wasn't polished or flashy, it was old, worn, and scratched in places. But the significance of it was unmistakable. "What the hell is this?" Duke muttered, frowning as he turned it over in his hands. Blaze's face went pale. Duke. Put that back. Duke ignored him. Looks like our old friend here used to play soldier, he said, his voice dripping with mockery. He glanced down at the man and grinned cruelly. What are you, some kind of war hero? Huh? That what you want us to believe? Still, the man didn't respond. He just sat there, calm and steady as before, like he hadn't even noticed the badge had been taken from his bag. But if you looked closer, if you really paid attention, you might have seen it. The way his shoulders squared just slightly. The way his fingers curled tighter on his knees. Clara saw it. Her breath hitched. Oh no. Put it back, Duke, Blaze repeated, louder this time. His voice trembled just a little, enough for the others to hear. Duke shot him a look. What's your problem, Blaze? Blaze shook his head. You don't mess with guys like this. Guys like what? Mick snorted. He's a nobody. Blaze's jaw tightened. No. He's not. Duke waved him off and turned back to the man, holding up the badge like it was a joke. You hear that, old man? Your little buddy here thinks we ought to leave you alone. That you're special or something. But you don't look so special to me. The man still didn't move. His breathing was slow and steady, his head bowed just enough to keep his eyes hidden. But the silence, the absolute stillness, had started to make the gang uncomfortable. It was Mick who broke the quiet first. Duke. Maybe Blaze is right. Duke snapped. What's gotten into you guys? He's nothing. Just a bum with an old badge. But even as he said the words, Duke couldn't shake the feeling crawling up the back of his neck, the feeling that something was wrong. He looked back down at the man, suddenly unsure of himself. That's when the man finally moved. Inside the gas station, Clara's fingers gripped the edge of the counter, her knuckles white as she watched the scene unfold outside. The afternoon sunlight poured through the dirty window, casting streaks of gold across her face, but she didn't notice. All she could see was the group of bikers, the Steel Reapers, and the old man they'd cornered in the parking lot. The Reapers had a reputation around town, and it wasn't a good one. Loud engines, smashed windows, stolen gas, they caused trouble just because they could. Most folks avoided eye contact when they rolled through town, their leather jackets and snarling engines like a dark storm that everyone hoped would pass quickly. Clara had seen them before. Everyone had. She was only 17, but even she knew better than to step between the Reapers and their fun. The gas station wasn't her dream job, but she needed it to help her mom cover the bills. Staying out of trouble was rule number one. That's why her heart pounded in her chest as she watched Duke, their leader, kick over the man's bag like he was stomping out a campfire. She wanted to call the sheriff, really, she did, but what good would that do? Sheriff Grady was an hour away on a good day, and the Reapers knew it. By the time he showed up, they'd be long gone, leaving nothing but an empty gas station and the echoes of their roaring engines. Besides, who would the sheriff even believe? The girl behind the counter, or the Steel Reapers? Clara bit her lip and whispered to herself. Maybe I should go out there. But even as the words escaped her mouth, her legs wouldn't move. She stayed rooted behind the counter, frozen with indecision. That's when she heard a loud crash that made her jump. Outside, Duke had sent the old man's duffel bag skidding across the pavement, spilling its meager contents for everyone to see. A pair of scuffed, military-style boots tumbled out first. They were old but clean, with the kind of wear that comes from long miles and hard years. Next came a tightly rolled sleeping mat, the edges frayed but still functional. A small metal tin fell out as well, landing with a hollow clank. Lastly, a photograph fluttered gently to the ground like a falling leaf. The bikers paused, their laughter fading just a little as they glanced at the photo. Mick, the skinny one with the chain necklace, bent down and picked it up. He squinted at the picture, holding it closer to his face. "What's this?" Mick said, his voice dripping with mockery. He turned the photo around to show the others. "Check it out, looks like ol' grandpa here used to play soldier." The picture was faded, its edges worn, but the image was clear enough. It showed a younger version of the man, standing tall and proud in a military uniform, surrounded by a group of soldiers. Their faces were tough, serious, and battle-hardened. It wasn't the kind of photo you kept for vanity, it was the kind you carried when it meant something. Duke snorted and grabbed the photo from Mick's hands, barely giving it a glance before flicking it to the ground. "Ain't that cute? War hero turned parking lot decoration." He looked back at the man, his grin wide and full of teeth. "You deaf, old man? I asked you a question." The man didn't respond. He just sat there, his back straight, his hands resting on his knees. Calm. Silent. His stillness only made Duke angrier. "What's wrong? Cat got your tongue?" Duke sneered, stepping closer. Blaze, the quiet one with the thick beard and narrowed eyes, shifted uncomfortably. He stood back a few paces from the others, his arms crossed tight over his chest. "Duke," he muttered, "maybe we oughta just leave him alone." Duke whipped his head around, glaring at Blaze like he'd said something offensive. "What's the matter with you? You goin' soft on me?" Blaze didn't answer right away. His gaze lingered on the man sitting against the wall, his brows drawn low in thought. Something about the way the man carried himself, something about his quiet stillness didn't sit right with Blaze. It reminded him of something he couldn't quite put his finger on. Something he'd seen before, maybe on TV, maybe in a story someone told him. It was the kind of stillness that felt dangerous. "I'm just sayin'," Blaze grumbled, "there's no point messin' with him. He ain't done nothin'. Duke rolled his eyes. "And that's exactly why we're messin' with him, Blaze. This town's got too many nobodies already. What's one more?" He turned back to the man on the ground. "Besides, I think he needs a little motivation to remember his manners." The others chuckled, emboldened by Duke's confidence. Mick nudged Reggie with his elbow. "Yeah, maybe we'll teach him how to say thank you when someone kicks over his junk." The man remained quiet. His face was still hidden under the brim of his cap, his expression impossible to read. But his hands, Clara noticed his hands. She squinted through the window and saw them resting on his knees, perfectly still except for the fingers of his right hand. They twitched once, curling and uncurling like he was counting something. 1, 2, 3. Duke crouched down in front of him, close enough that Clara could see the dust on his leather boots. "You're awful quiet, Gramps," Duke taunted. He reached out and snatched the old man's hat right off his head, flinging it to the ground. "What? You ain't got no fight left in ya?" That was Duke's second mistake. The cap landed on the pavement a few feet away, its fabric worn and fraying at the edges. But that wasn't what caught Clara's attention. It was the name stitched neatly into the side of it, the letters faded but still legible, U.S. Army, Colonel R. Andrews. Her eyes widened. Colonel. Clara's mind spun as she tried to process what she'd just seen. She'd learned about the military ranks in school, and a colonel wasn't just anyone. That was someone who'd been through it all, someone who commanded respect, led soldiers, made life and death decisions. The realization sent a chill down her spine. Outside, Duke didn't seem to care. He stood up again, holding his arms out wide like he was putting on a show. "Guess he ain't got much fight left in him, huh, boys?" The others laughed, but their chuckles were weaker now, less confident. Even Mick, who always found humor in anything, looked a little unsure. Blaze's jaw tightened, and he glanced at the cap Duke had thrown aside. "Duke," Blaze said again, his voice lower this time. "I'm tellin' you, let's go." Duke ignored him. What's wrong with you today, huh? You scared of a bum? He jabbed a finger toward the old man. Look at him, he ain't got nothin'. You think he's gonna get up and start throwin' punches or somethin'? For the first time since the bikers had arrived, the man moved. It was slight, almost unnoticeable, but Clara saw it. He lifted his head just a little, just enough that the sunlight caught his face. His eyes, sharp and piercing, locked onto Duke like a hawk zeroing in on its prey. Duke's grin faltered for half a second. It was quick, so quick that Clara almost missed it, but it was there. A flicker of doubt. A spark of something he wasn't used to feeling, unease. The man's voice, when it finally came, was calm and low, but it carried an edge sharp enough to cut through steel. You should pick that up. Duke blinked. What? The man tilted his chin slightly toward the cap lying on the pavement. My hat, he said, his tone even. Pick it up. The laughter stopped. The parking lot fell silent except for the faint hum of cicadas in the distance. The bikers looked at each other, confusion written across their faces. Mick scratched his head, like he couldn't believe what he'd just heard. Duke barked out a laugh. You kiddin' me? You want me to pick up your hat? He shook his head and took a step closer. I think you're confused about how this works, Gramps. You're the one who picks stuff up when I tell you to. The man didn't flinch. His eyes stayed locked on Duke, unblinking, unshaken. Clara felt her heart hammering in her chest again, harder this time. The air felt heavy, charged with something she couldn't quite name. Then the man spoke again, his voice calm but final. I'll say it one more time. His hands were still on his knees, fingers curled just slightly. Pick it up. The air was heavy. Not with words, there weren't any, but with something else, something you could feel but not see. Clara watched through the window, her heart racing faster than it ever had before. She had no idea who this man was, but his voice carried a weight she couldn't explain. It wasn't loud or threatening. It didn't need to be. Those three words, pick it up, hit the ground like stones. For a split second, Clara thought Duke might actually do it. Just pick up the cap and leave. But Duke wasn't the kind of man to back down, not in front of his crew. His reputation mattered too much. The Steel Reapers followed him because he acted like nothing could touch him. And no way was he going to let some quiet old man ruin that. Duke squared his shoulders and leaned in, towering over the man on the ground. Oh, I get it now, he said, his voice thick with sarcasm. You're one of those guys, huh? Think you can boss people around just cause you used to play soldier? The man didn't respond. He didn't need to. Tell me something, Gramps. Duke nudged the man's knee with the toe of his boot, testing him, taunting him. What's an old war hero like you doing in a dump like this? Couldn't hack it in the real world? Or maybe you're just a coward who got lucky and lived to tell the tale. Blaze took a step back, his arms still crossed, but his body tense now. His instincts were screaming at him, louder with every passing second. Something wasn't right. The old man's silence, it wasn't fear. It wasn't weakness. It was something else, something Duke didn't seem to recognize but Blaze did. It was the kind of silence that came before a storm. Duke, man, Blaze muttered, his voice low. Let's just go. Seriously. This guy ain't worth it. But Duke ignored him, his focus locked on the man in front of him. The others, Mick and Reggie, snickered nervously, watching the scene unfold like kids watching a firecracker they weren't sure was lit. They were waiting for something to happen. They just didn't know what. Duke smirked, his confidence growing as the man still didn't react. See, fellas. This is what happens when you get old. You lose your edge. You lose your fight. Then you end up like him, washed up, sitting in parking lots, waiting for somebody to feel sorry for you. With that, Duke lifted his foot and stomped on the cap, grinding it into the asphalt. He twisted his heel back and forth like he was snuffing out a cigarette, his eyes never leaving the man's face. Clara gasped. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. Sure, Duke had caused trouble before. He'd broken windows, stolen snacks, and once even siphoned gas without paying. But this was different. This wasn't petty vandalism. This was mean. And it felt like a line had been crossed. The man finally moved. Slowly, carefully, he shifted his weight and stood up. Clara's breath caught in her throat. The man wasn't particularly tall. Duke still had a few inches on him, but when he stood, he seemed bigger somehow. His shoulders squared, his back straightened, and his presence filled the space like a shadow stretching across the ground. He wasn't hunched or frail like Clara would have expected. No, he was solid. Grounded. And when he lifted his head fully to meet Duke's gaze, Clara felt a shiver run down her spine. His eyes were sharp, ice blue and steady, with a kind of calm intensity that Clara couldn't describe. They weren't the eyes of someone who was afraid. They weren't even angry. They were the eyes of someone who knew something Duke didn't, something that made him dangerous. "You shouldn't have done that," the man said softly, his voice just loud enough to carry through the parking lot. Duke barked out a laugh, but it sounded forced this time, like he was trying to convince himself more than anyone else. "Oh yeah? And what are you gonna do about it, old man? You gonna fight me? Maybe throw one of your army boots at me?" The man didn't move. He just stood there, still as a stone, his arms relaxed at his sides. "Pick up the hat," he said again, his voice low and calm. "Now." Duke's grin faltered. It was slight, almost imperceptible, but it was there. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty flashed across his face. He looked at the man's eyes, really looked, and something about them gave him pause. Mick nudged Reggie. "Hey, maybe we should go, man. This guy's creepin' me out." "Shut up," Duke snapped, though his voice wasn't quite as strong as before. He turned back to the man, his bravado still there, but it was thinner now, like a sheet of ice beginning to crack. "You think you're scarin' me, huh? I've dealt with tougher guys than you. You're just some washed-up soldier who thinks he's still important." The man tilted his head slightly, like he was studying Duke. When he spoke again, his tone was just as calm, but there was an edge to it now, like a blade hidden in velvet. "You're a fool." Duke blinked. "What'd you say?" "I said you're a fool," the man repeated, his voice steady. "You walk around here, acting tough, thinking you're the baddest man in the room. But you don't know what tough is. You don't know what it's like to face real men who'd kill you without blinking. Men who don't care about your leather jacket or your little gang." Duke's face turned red. "You better watch your mouth, old man." The man didn't flinch. "Or what?" he asked quietly. "What are you gonna do? Hit me? You think I haven't taken a punch before? I've taken worse, boy. A lot worse." Duke's jaw tightened, and Clara could see the anger building in his eyes. She wanted to shout, to tell him to stop, but her voice wouldn't come. She could only watch as the tension between the two men grew heavier with every passing second. Blaze took another step back. He wasn't a coward, he'd been in his fair share of fights, but this was different. There was something about the old man that sent every instinct in his body into overdrive, screaming at him to get out. He glanced at the others, but they were still watching Duke, caught between amusement and discomfort. "Duke, I'm telling you," Blaze said, his voice sharp now. "We need to leave. Now." Duke ignored him. "You think you're better than me," he spat, pointing a finger at the man's chest. "You don't know anything about me, you hear? You don't know who I am." The man's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. "I know exactly who you are," he said. You're a bully. You pick on people who can't fight back because it makes you feel strong. But deep down, you're weak. That's why you travel in a pack, because you're scared to stand alone. Duke snapped. You don't know a damn thing about me, he roared, and before anyone could stop him, he lunged forward, shoving the man hard with both hands. Clara gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. But the man didn't stumble. He didn't even move. He absorbed the shove like a mountain absorbs wind, standing firm, his boots planted in the ground. And then he acted. It happened so fast that Clara almost didn't see it. 1 second, Duke was standing there, his hands still outstretched. The next, the man's right hand shot up, grabbing Duke's wrist in a grip so strong that Duke's face contorted in pain. Let go of me. Duke snarled, trying to yank his arm free. The man's voice was low and calm, but it carried a weight that made everyone freeze. Don't touch me. The parking lot was silent now, save for Duke's low groans and the faint scrape of boots against asphalt as the bikers hesitated. For the first time, they didn't look so sure of themselves. Clara held her breath. Her face was almost pressed to the grimy gas station window, eyes wide with disbelief. Whatever she had expected to happen when Duke started this nonsense, it wasn't this. The old man Colonel Andrews stood there like a statue, calm, steady, unshaken. Duke rolled onto his side, clutching his wrist and glaring up at him. His face was red with both rage and embarrassment. You think you're tough, huh? He spat, his voice shaking. You're gonna regret this. The colonel didn't respond. He simply stood there, his posture unnervingly perfect, like he had all the time in the world. His presence filled the space, quiet but unmissable. That was when Blaze, Duke's second-in-command, stepped forward. Hold up, Blaze said, his voice steadier than the others but tight with caution. His eyes scanned Colonel Andrews up and down, taking in the way he stood, the way he moved. Blaze wasn't as reckless as Duke. He paid attention to details most people missed, and right now, every alarm bell in his mind was going off. This wasn't some helpless drifter. Who are you? Blaze asked, his tone quieter. There was no mockery in his voice now, just a genuine question. The colonel turned his head slowly to meet Blaze's gaze. For a moment, the two locked eyes, and Blaze felt his breath catch in his throat. The way the old man looked at him, it was like he could see right through him. Like he'd already measured him up and found him wanting. You don't want to know, the colonel replied softly. His voice was calm, even polite, but there was a finality to it, as if it was more of a warning than an answer. Duke, however, wasn't done. Pride was a stubborn thing, and his had taken a blow too big to ignore. He staggered to his feet, still cradling his wrist, and snarled at his crew, "What are you idiots waiting for? There's one of him and 4 of us." The bikers glanced at each other uncertainly. Mick and Reggie shifted on their feet, clearly uneasy, but Blaze's jaw tightened. He didn't like this. Not one bit. Duke, Blaze started, but Duke wasn't listening. He was already charging toward the colonel again, his face twisted in anger. It happened even faster this time. Colonel Andrews shifted slightly to the side as Duke lunged. With a practiced motion, he grabbed Duke's arm and twisted, using Duke's own momentum against him. There was no wasted energy, no unnecessary movement, just precision. Duke hit the pavement again, this time harder, and the air left his lungs in a rush. Clara let out a small gasp inside the gas station, her hands now trembling. She couldn't tear her eyes away. This wasn't a street fight, it wasn't even close. It was something else entirely. The way the colonel moved was too controlled, too efficient. It was the kind of thing you saw in movies, except this wasn't a movie. This was real. Duke groaned, writhing on the ground, but this time, he didn't get up. He just stayed there, breathing heavily, his face twisted in a mix of pain and shock. Blaze stepped forward again, but slower this time. "You're military," he said, his voice low and careful. It wasn't a question. Colonel Andrews turned his gaze back to Blaze, his expression giving nothing away. "I was," he said quietly. Blaze's fists clenched at his sides. He knew it. He'd seen guys like this before, not often, but enough to recognize the signs. The way he moved, the way he carried himself, it was all too deliberate. Too professional. "You're not just some random vet, are you?" Blaze pressed, his voice almost accusing now. The colonel didn't answer. Instead, he glanced down at Duke, who was still on the ground, and then looked back up at Blaze. "I told him to pick up the hat. That was all." Blaze swallowed hard. He could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. He turned and shot a look at Mick and Reggie, who were both frozen in place, unsure of what to do. "We're leaving," Blaze said firmly. "What?" Duke sputtered, lifting his head to glare at him. "You're backing down?" From him. Blaze ignored him. "This isn't a fight we're winning, Duke," he said sharply. "And you know it?" Duke opened his mouth to argue, but Blaze shot him a look that made him go quiet. Duke may have been the leader of the Steel Reapers, but right now, he wasn't in charge anymore. Blaze was. And Blaze was smart enough to know when to cut their losses. "Let's go," Blaze repeated, motioning to Mick and Reggie. The two hesitated for a second, but then they nodded and stepped back toward their bikes. Blaze turned and looked at the colonel one last time, his gaze lingering for a moment. "I don't know who you are, old man," Blaze said quietly. "But I'm gonna find out." The colonel said nothing. He just stood there, watching as Blaze and the others climbed onto their bikes. Duke, after a moment of seething silence, finally forced himself to his feet, glaring at Colonel Andrews like he wanted to burn a hole through him. "This ain't over," Duke growled, his voice low and dangerous. The colonel met his glare, unflinching. "It is if you're smart," he said simply. Duke didn't respond. He just turned and stalked over to his bike, throwing one last venomous glance over his shoulder. The engines roared to life as the bikers started up their Harleys, filling the parking lot with the sound of growling thunder. One by one, they pulled away, tires kicking up dust as they sped off down the highway. Clara let out the breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her hands were shaking as she backed away from the window, pressing a hand to her chest. She couldn't believe what she'd just seen. Outside, the colonel bent down and picked up his cap. He dusted it off carefully, smoothing the fabric with his fingers, before placing it back on his head. Then, he turned and walked over to the gas station door. Clara froze as the bell above the door jingled and the colonel stepped inside. He was calm, quiet, like nothing had happened at all. "You okay, miss?" he asked, his voice soft now. Clara blinked, staring at him. "Why you asking if I'm okay?" she stammered. I mean, you." The colonel gave her a small smile, the kind that didn't quite reach his eyes. "They weren't going to hurt me," he said simply. "They were just boys playing at being tough. Happens all the time." Clara shook her head, still trying to process what she'd seen. "You're not just some drifter, are you?" she whispered. The colonel's smile faded slightly. He looked at her for a moment, as if weighing his words carefully. Finally, he said, "Not anymore." Clara's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" The colonel didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled bill, placing it gently on the counter. "For the coffee," he said. "And the trouble?" Clara glanced at the bill. It was a $20 note and then back up at him. "But, the coffee's only $1. The colonel shrugged. "Keep the change." With that, he turned and walked back toward the door. The bell jingled again as he stepped outside and made his way back to his spot against the wall. Clara watched him go, her mind racing. Who was he? Where had he come from? And why did she have the strangest feeling that there was so much more to him than he let on? As she turned the events of the past few minutes over in her mind, one thing became clear: whoever Colonel Andrews really was, Duke and the Steel Reapers had no idea what kind of fire they just played with. And Clara had a sinking feeling that this wasn't the last time she'd see those bikers or the Colonel again. Outside, the sun had dipped even lower, and long shadows stretched across the parking lot like creeping fingers. Colonel Andrews returned to his spot by the wall, settling himself on the duffel bag as though nothing had happened. His movements were calm and measured, like a man who was simply passing time. If someone had just arrived at the gas station, they would never have guessed the chaos that had unfolded only moments before. But inside the gas station, Clara was still frozen behind the counter, her hands trembling. She couldn't stop staring out the window at the Colonel. The way he had handled Duke and the others, it wasn't normal. The speed, the precision, it wasn't something you just picked up in a bar fight. It was training. The kind of training that only came from years spent in dangerous places. Places most people couldn't imagine. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sharp ring of the store's phone. She jumped, her pulse still racing, and fumbled to pick it up. "Murphy's gas station," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Hey, Clara," said a gruff voice on the other end. It was old Mr. Barnes, the station's owner. "Everything all right down there? You sound a little off." Clara hesitated, glancing back out the window at the Colonel. He was sitting there quietly, almost like he hadn't just sent Duke sprawling across the asphalt. Yeah. Everything's fine," she said. "Why?" Barnes chuckled. "Just checking in. Had a fella come by earlier, said he saw the Reapers headin' your way. Wanted to make sure they weren't causing trouble." Clara swallowed hard. The Steel Reapers were well known in town, and their reputation wasn't exactly sparkling. Most folks avoided them entirely, locking their doors and pulling their shades when they roared through town on their bikes. It wasn't worth picking a fight with them. At least, not for most people. "They were here," she said softly. "But they're gone now." Barnes's voice turned sharp. "Gone? What happened?" Clara hesitated again, unsure how to explain it. What had just happened? She wasn't sure she even understood it herself. "Some guy, an older guy, he, dealt with them." "Dealt with them?" Barnes repeated. "What are you talking about?" "I don't know," Clara said, lowering her voice as if the Colonel could hear her through the window. "They started picking on him, but he handled them. It was like," she trailed off, struggling to find the right words. "Like he's done it before." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Finally, Barnes let out a low whistle. "You don't say. What's his name?" Clara glanced out the window again, watching as the Colonel sat quietly, his face unreadable. "I don't know," she said. "But his hat says Colonel R. Andrews. Army, I think." Barnes was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, almost careful. "Colonel Andrews, huh? You sure about that name?" Clara frowned. "Yeah. Why?" "No reason," Barnes said quickly, but there was something odd in his tone, like he was holding something back. "Just, keep an eye on things, all right? And if those bikers come back, you call me right away." "Okay," Clara said, still confused. "Thanks, Mr. Barnes." She hung up the phone and stared at it for a moment, her mind spinning. There was something about the way Barnes had reacted to the Colonel's name, like he recognized it. Like it meant something. But what? Outside, the evening grew darker. The sky turned a deep shade of purple as the first stars began to appear, and the gas station's flickering neon sign buzzed to life. The colonel remained exactly where he was, unmoving, like a statue. He seemed content to sit there as the world turned around him. But Clara couldn't shake the feeling that the quiet wouldn't last. Meanwhile, a few miles down the highway, the Steel Reapers were anything but quiet. Duke led the group, his knuckles white around the handlebars as he tore down the road. His face was twisted in anger, his teeth gritted together so hard it hurt. He replayed what had happened in his head over and over again, the way the old man had taken him down like he was nothing. Nothing. Pull over! Duke shouted suddenly, his voice cutting through the roar of the engines. The bikers veered to the side of the road, skidding to a stop on the shoulder. Duke jumped off his bike, pacing back and forth like a caged animal. Blaze dismounted, watching him carefully. "Calm down, Duke," Blaze said. "This isn't." "Calm down." Duke roared, spinning to face him. "Did you see what he did to me back there? To all of us? We can't let that slide." Blaze crossed his arms, his jaw tight. "That wasn't some random drifter, Duke. You saw it yourself. The way he moved, the guy's military. Maybe even special forces. You don't mess with someone like that." Duke sneered, his face dark with fury. "I don't care who he is. Nobody makes a fool out of me. Nobody." Reggie and Mick stood nearby, exchanging nervous glances. They weren't used to seeing Duke this worked up. He was always the biggest, toughest guy in the room, the one who called the shots. But the colonel had shaken him badly. "What do you want to do?" Blaze asked, his voice calm but firm. "Go back there? Pick another fight you can't win." "We'll go back," Duke growled. "But not tonight. Tomorrow. And we'll bring the rest of the crew." Blaze's frown deepened. "Duke, that's not a good idea." "I don't care." Duke snapped, his voice echoing through the night. "Nobody makes me look weak and gets away with it. That old man's gonna regret the day he crossed me." Blaze sighed, shaking his head. He knew there was no reasoning with Duke when he was like this. Once Duke had his mind set on something, there was no stopping him. But deep down, Blaze couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into something they didn't understand. Whoever the colonel was, he wasn't just some harmless old man. And whatever Duke thought he was proving, it wasn't going to end the way he wanted. Back at Murphy's gas station, Clara locked up the store for the night. She hesitated as she stepped outside, glancing toward the spot where Colonel Andrews still sat. He was staring out at the empty highway, his expression unreadable. He didn't look up as she approached. Sir," Clara said quietly. The colonel turned his head slightly, his calm eyes meeting hers. "Yes." Clara shifted nervously, suddenly unsure of what to say. You can come inside if you want. It's getting cold out here." The colonel gave her a small smile, but he shook his head. "Thank you, miss, but I'll be fine." Clara frowned. "Are you sure? I mean, they might come back." "They might," the colonel agreed, his voice steady. "But if they do, I'll be ready." Clara studied him for a moment, her unease growing. "Who are you?" she asked softly. "Really?" The colonel didn't answer right away. He looked out at the darkening horizon, his eyes distant, like he was seeing something far away, something Clara couldn't begin to imagine. "Just a man trying to mind his own business," he said finally. "But some people don't know how to leave well enough alone." Clara shivered, pulling her jacket tighter around herself. There was something about the colonel that she couldn't figure out. He wasn't threatening, not to her, but there was a weight about him, like he carried something heavy on his shoulders. Something from a long time ago. "Good night, miss," the colonel said softly, turning his gaze back to her. Clara nodded slowly. "Good night." As she walked to her car, She glanced over her shoulder one last time. The colonel was still sitting there, motionless, his silhouette framed against the glow of the gas station lights. She couldn't help but feel like she was leaving him to face something she didn't understand. And she had a terrible feeling that tomorrow was going to be worse. The parking lot fell deathly silent. The colonel stood there, holding up the weathered military badge, its metal edges glinting faintly under the flickering gas station lights. It wasn't just any badge, it was a Distinguished Service Cross. Even for those who didn't know what it meant, the authority it carried was undeniable. The biker's confidence evaporated like mist under a hot sun. Duke's face twisted, his bravado cracking for the first time that night. He took a half step back, his eyes darting between the badge and the colonel's steady gaze. The men behind him, Reggie, Blaze, and Mick, shifted uneasily, their earlier cockiness replaced by confusion and a growing sense of fear. What is this?" Duke stammered, his voice faltering. "It's called respect," Colonel Andrews said quietly. "You wouldn't know much about it?" He tucked the badge back into his coat, his movements deliberate and calm. But his eyes never left Duke, sharp and unwavering. "You walk around pretending to be tough. Intimidating people, scaring kids, thinking you own the world because you ride a loud bike and swing your fists. But toughness isn't what you think it is." Blaze cleared his throat, stepping forward. "What's your deal, old man? Who the hell are you?" The colonel turned his gaze to Blaze, and for the first time, his calm expression flickered, revealing something harder beneath. "Who am I?" he repeated, his voice dropping to a growl. "I'm the man who fought so you could grow up in a country where you're free to act like fools." He took a step closer, and the bikers instinctively moved back. The sheer force of his presence was overwhelming. "I'm the man who's buried more friends than you've got tattoos. The man who's walked through fire and come out the other side when everyone said it couldn't be done." Duke clenched his jaw, trying to hold on to what little pride he had left. "You're full of crap." Colonel Andrews ignored him. "You think this world owes you something? You think you're invincible because you've never met someone willing to stand up to you? Let me tell you something, boys. Real strength comes from sacrifice. From discipline. From knowing what it means to protect others instead of tearing them down." Reggie, the youngest of the bikers, shuffled nervously. He couldn't meet Andrews' eyes. "What is he talking about, Duke?" he muttered. "He's just some old guy." Andrews turned sharply to Reggie, fixing him with a stare so intense the young man shrank back. "You think I'm just some old man?" Andrews asked, his voice quiet and even. "Then let me educate you." He reached down to his duffel bag, unzipping it slowly. The bikers tensed, their hands twitching, ready for a fight. But what Andrews pulled out wasn't a weapon. It was a folded American flag, its edges crisp and clean. He held it up carefully, reverently. "This flag was given to me after we buried my best friend," Andrews said, his voice low. "He died saving my life in a country you couldn't find on a map. I carried him back through enemy fire so he wouldn't be left behind." For a long moment, no one spoke. Even Duke, whose face still burned with anger, couldn't find any words. Andrews continued, his voice growing stronger. "You boys play at being a gang. You talk about loyalty, brotherhood, toughness, but you wouldn't know what any of that means if it stared you in the face. You think being tough means breaking things and hurting people. Let me tell you what tough looks like." He stepped forward, his eyes locked on Duke, unblinking. "Tough is carrying a man twice your size across a battlefield while bullets tear through the air around you. Tough is standing between your friends and an enemy who wants to wipe you off the face of the earth. Tough is holding it together when you've seen things that would break most men." The bikers stared at him, speechless. Even the crickets in the grass seemed to have gone quiet. Andrews turned to Duke, his gaze unrelenting. "And you? You're not tough. You're scared." Scared of the day someone shows you for what you really are, a bully who's never been tested? Duke's face turned red, his fists clenching at his sides. You don't know me, he shouted, his voice cracking with emotion. You don't know what I've been through. You're right, Andrews replied, his tone softening just a little. I don't know your story. But I know this, you're better than this. All of you are. He turned to the other bikers, his voice steady. I've seen young men just like you, lost and angry. They found a family in their brothers, in their unit. They fought for something bigger than themselves, and it changed them. Blaze frowned, the words striking a chord. Why do you care? He muttered. Why are you telling us this? Because I've seen how this ends, Andrews said. And it's not pretty. He looked at Duke again, and for a moment, his expression softened. You think you're winning this game you're playing, but you're not. You're on a road that leads to nowhere, son. Sooner or later, you're gonna end up in a ditch or behind bars, and there won't be anyone to blame but yourself. Duke glared at him, his breathing ragged, but he didn't say a word. Andrews straightened, slipping the flag back into his bag with careful hands. You can keep playing the part, or you can decide to be something better. The choice is yours. He turned his back on the bikers and walked slowly toward the gas station door. The quiet was deafening. No one dared move or speak. Even Duke, furious as he was, couldn't bring himself to stop him. Clara watched from inside, her heart pounding. When Andrews stepped through the door, she let out the breath she hadn't realized she was holding. That was, she started, but she couldn't find the words. Andrews looked at her and gave a small, tired smile. Sometimes words are enough. Sometimes they aren't. Outside, the bikers stood frozen in place, unsure of what to do. Reggie broke the silence first, his voice small. Duke, maybe we should go. Shut up, Duke muttered, but his voice lacked its usual venom. He looked at the gas station, his expression torn between anger and something else, something he didn't want to admit. Blaze put a hand on his shoulder. Let it go, man. For a long moment, Duke didn't respond. Then, finally, he turned away. Let's get out of here. The bikers mounted their bikes one by one, the engines rumbling to life. But the noise sounded hollow now, as if the fight had gone out of them. They pulled away, the roar of their engines fading into the distance. Inside the gas station, Clara stared at Andrews in awe. You didn't even touch them. Andrews smiled faintly. Sometimes the truth hits harder than any fist. Clara shook her head, still amazed. Who are you, really? Andrews sighed, his eyes distant, like he was looking at something far away. Just someone who's been through enough to know better. The sound of the bikers' engines disappeared into the distance, leaving an unsettling silence in the parking lot. Colonel Andrews stood by the counter inside the gas station, his hands resting lightly on his worn-out duffel bag. Clara was still staring at him, her eyes wide with awe. I don't understand, she whispered, finally breaking the quiet. Why didn't you just fight them? You could've. I mean, you handled them so easily before. Andrews turned his head slightly, his gaze fixed on the window where the bikers had last been seen. There's no glory in fighting fools, he replied softly. They're angry because life didn't hand them the respect they think they deserve. Teaching them a lesson with my fists wouldn't change that. Clara frowned, her young face scrunching in thought. But they didn't deserve your kindness. Andrews turned his sharp, yet kind eyes to her. Kindness has nothing to do with what people deserve. It has to do with who you are. Clara blinked, processing the words. Outside, the night seemed to grow darker, the shadows stretching across the gas station parking lot. After a moment, she spoke again. What do you think will happen to them? Andrews let out a deep, steady breath. That's up to them. a man can walk to the edge of a cliff and still turn around. The choice is always his. He paused, looking back out the window into the night, his face momentarily unreadable. Some men just need to hear the truth before they make that choice. The bikers rode in silence, their usual rowdy energy gone. Reggie trailed behind the others, his thoughts racing. The colonel's words played over and over in his mind. "You're on a road that leads to nowhere." He glanced at Duke, who rode stiffly at the front, his jaw clenched. The headlights of their bikes cut through the darkness, but even the familiar rumble of their Harleys didn't feel the same tonight. Finally, Blaze pulled over at the side of the road, parking his bike under a flickering streetlight. "I need a minute," he muttered as he cut the engine. The others followed suit, pulling up beside him. Duke swung off his bike, pacing like a caged animal. "You're just gonna stop here? We've got places to be." "Where, Duke?" Blaze shot back, his voice sharper than usual. "Where are we even going?" Duke turned on him, his face darkening. "What's that supposed to mean?" Blaze stood tall, pointing back in the direction of the gas station. "That guy back there? He wasn't wrong. Look at us. Running around, starting fights with people who've done nothing to us. Is this what we're about now?" Reggie, still straddling his bike, finally spoke up. "He said we were scared." Duke whipped around, his eyes blazing. "Don't you start, Reggie." But the younger man held his ground, his voice steady. "You are scared, Duke. You pick fights because you don't want people to see how lost you are." For a second, Duke looked like he might hit him, his fists twitching at his sides. But something stopped him, maybe the look in Reggie's eyes. Or maybe the colonel's words had hit deeper than he wanted to admit. Blaze stepped closer. "Duke, listen. We've been riding together for years, man. I thought we were about having each other's backs. About being brothers. But tonight," he shook his head. "Tonight felt different. That guy wasn't afraid of us, and it wasn't because he could fight. It was because he had nothing to prove." Duke swallowed hard, his face flickering with uncertainty. "So what? You wanna quit? You wanna go back to your boring life?" Blaze looked him square in the eye. "No. I want us to be better. I want us to stop acting like thugs." The silence stretched, heavy and thick. Reggie finally dismounted his bike and walked over to Duke. "We don't have to keep going like this, man. It's not too late." Duke turned away, staring down the empty road. For once, he didn't have a comeback. His shoulders slumped slightly, as though the weight of his choices was finally catching up to him. Clara busied herself behind the counter, trying to process everything she'd seen. She stole another glance at Colonel Andrews, who sat quietly at a small table in the corner of the store, nursing a cup of stale coffee. His back was straight, his movements precise, so different from the defeated homeless man the bikers had mistaken him for. Her curiosity got the better of her. She grabbed a rag, pretending to wipe down the counters, and casually made her way over. "You said you were in the army," she started, trying to sound casual. What happened?" "I mean, after the war." Andrews looked up at her, his expression thoughtful. For a moment, Clara worried she'd crossed a line. But then he smiled faintly, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "After the war, the world didn't know what to do with men like me," he said quietly. "We were trained to fight, to lead, to survive. But there's no training for coming home to a world that's moved on without you." He looked down at the cup of coffee in his hands. "Some men found jobs. Families. Peace. Others got lost." Clara frowned. "But you're not lost." Andrews looked up at her, his steady gaze meeting hers. "No. I'm not." "Why not?" she asked softly. He thought for a long moment before answering. Because I found a reason to keep going. I realized my job didn't end when the war did. There are still people out here who need help, who need to hear the truth. Clara stared at him, her chest tightening. Like those guys tonight. Andrews nodded. Like those guys. She leaned against the counter, the rag forgotten in her hands. Do you think they'll listen to you? He shrugged slightly. Some will. Some won't. But that's not for me to decide. All I can do is show them the way. For a while, neither of them said anything. The hum of the gas station lights filled the quiet, and the faint sound of crickets echoed through the night air. The sun rose over Murphy's gas station, painting the horizon in shades of orange and gold. Colonel Andrews stood at the edge of the parking lot, his duffel bag slung over his shoulder. Clara watched him from the door, a fresh cup of coffee in her hands. Are you leaving already? She called out. Andrews turned back, his face calm and unreadable. There's nothing left for me here. Clara frowned. Where will you go? He looked out at the road stretching ahead of him, endless and open. Wherever I'm needed. Clara hesitated, then stepped forward, holding out the coffee. Take this, at least. On the house. Andrews smiled faintly and accepted the cup, his rough hands wrapping around it. Thank you, Clara. She swallowed, trying to find the right words. You know, you're not just a hero from the past. You're a hero now. Andrews met her gaze, his eyes softening. Heroes are just ordinary people who do the right thing when it matters. With that, he turned and began walking down the road, his silhouette growing smaller with each step. Clara watched him go, the weight of his words settling deep in her heart. And somewhere down that same road, 4 bikers sat quietly in an empty diner, each of them lost in thought. For the first time in a long time, they weren't talking about fights or power or respect. Instead, they were thinking about a man who had shown them what real strength looked like and wondering if it wasn't too late to find it for themselves. The bikers' engines roared and faded into the distance, leaving only the soft hum of the evening breeze. Colonel Andrews stood silently for a moment, his shoulders relaxed, as if he had seen the scene play out 100 times before. It wasn't the first time he'd dealt with men who thought intimidation was the way to power. But this had been different. This was just another reminder of the world he lived in now. Clara pushed through the gas station door, nearly stumbling as she rushed outside. Sir. Are you okay? Her voice was sharp with worry, her cheeks flushed from both nerves and awe. She paused, scanning him for any injuries, as though unable to believe someone his age could walk away from 4 bikers unscathed. Colonel Andrews turned to her, his expression calm, as if he'd just taken a walk in the park. Never better, young lady, he said softly, his deep voice carrying just enough warmth to put her at ease. Thanks for checking on me. Clara frowned. But she gestured toward where the bikers had ridden off, her words catching. They might have really hurt you. Andrews smiled faintly, bending to pick up his worn duffel bag. He shook it lightly to knock off the dust before slinging it back over his shoulder. They didn't. And that's what matters. She watched him carefully, her mind swirling with questions. Finally, one spilled out. Why didn't you tell them who you were earlier? I mean, she stumbled over her words, her hands gesturing wildly. If they'd known you were an army colonel, a war hero, they wouldn't have dared. Andrews straightened up, his eyes meeting hers. For a second, she saw something behind them, a quiet wisdom mixed with an old sadness. He shrugged, the edges of his mouth tugging upward into the faintest grin. Sometimes, people need to learn the hard way. Clara tilted her head. But why? You could have stopped them right away. He let out a deep breath, his gaze shifting to the road the bikers had taken. Stopping a man with words isn't the same as stopping him with fists. If I had just barked my name and titles at them, Sure, they might have left. But they wouldn't have learned a thing. Pride would have brought them back, and the next man they'd pick a fight with might not be able to defend himself. Clara blinked, taking it in. So, you let them push you just far enough to show them who you really are. Andrews nodded thoughtfully. Something like that. Clara looked down at the dusty asphalt, her expression pensive. That's kind of amazing, she whispered. Andrews chuckled lightly. There's nothing amazing about teaching people respect, Clara. It's something the world forgot a long time ago. Now and then, a man just needs a little reminder. Duke's knuckles were white as he gripped the handlebars of his bike, his injured wrist throbbing. He hadn't said a word since they'd left the gas station, and the others could feel his anger radiating like heat off pavement. Reggie, riding a few feet behind him, couldn't stop replaying what had happened. The colonel's calm face. The way he had moved, quick and precise, but never cruel. And those words. You're on a road that leads to nowhere. Blaze, still shaken, pulled up closer to Duke as they approached the outskirts of town. Duke, he yelled over the roar of their engines. Pull over, man. Duke ignored him, pressing harder on the throttle. Duke. Blaze barked again, louder this time. Finally, with a sharp turn, Duke skidded his bike onto the gravel shoulder of the road. The others followed, the sound of their engines falling into an uneasy quiet as they cut them off one by one. Blaze hopped off his bike, pulling off his helmet and wiping the sweat from his brow. What the hell, man? We need to talk. Duke swung off his Harley with a glare. What is there to talk about? Reggie looked nervously between them. About that guy back there. You know who he was, right? Duke's lip curled. Yeah, I know who he was, a nobody who got lucky. Lucky? Blaze snapped. He threw you down like it was nothing. You think that was luck? Did you even look at his badge? Duke shot him a cold glare but said nothing. Reggie stepped forward. That man was Colonel R. Andrews. He wasn't just some random soldier, Duke. He's a war hero. I think he let us get away with just a warning. Duke clenched his jaw, his fists twitching as he stared at the ground. His pride, his anger, none of it seemed to fit anymore. For the first time, he didn't know how to respond. Blaze sighed, shaking his head. Man, what are we even doing? We ride around, starting trouble, pushing people around who've done nothing to us. And for what? Respect? Fear? Who cares? Reggie nodded, his voice softer now. That guy didn't need to yell. Didn't need to threaten us. And he didn't have to throw a punch to make us feel small. You know why? Because he's got real strength. Not the kind we pretend to have. The silence hung heavy. Even the wind seemed to quiet down as Duke kicked at the gravel under his boots. Finally, he spoke, his voice rough but lower than before. So what? What do you want me to do? Apologize. Blaze looked at him, holding his gaze steady. No. I want you to think about what happens next. Because if we keep going like this, one day, we're gonna pick a fight with the wrong guy, and it won't end with a warning. Reggie added quietly, or worse, we'll hurt someone who doesn't deserve it. Someone like Clara or that guy. Duke didn't say anything, but something had changed. The fire in his eyes had dimmed, replaced by a flicker of doubt. He turned away, staring back down the empty road. The sky was beginning to darken, painting the horizon in shades of purple and orange. Clara leaned against the counter inside the gas station, still deep in thought. Outside, Colonel Andrews stood near the edge of the parking lot, duffel bag in hand, gazing out at the road ahead. Are you leaving now? Clara's voice broke the quiet as she stepped outside. Andrews turned, offering her a small nod. It's time to move on. Clara bit her lip, hesitating. You don't have to go, you know. You could, stay. Just for a while. He smiled softly. I appreciate that. But men like me don't stick around for long. She looked at the bag slung over his shoulder. Where will you go? Andrews followed her gaze to the open road stretching ahead. Wherever I'm needed. Clara nodded slowly. You helped them, didn't you? Even if they don't realize it yet. Andrews tilted his head, a small gleam of pride in his otherwise calm expression. Sometimes a man doesn't know he's been helped until he looks back and sees how far he's come. Clara smiled faintly. You're different from anyone I've ever met. Andrews chuckled, his deep voice rumbling like distant thunder. Maybe. Or maybe I'm just a reminder that there's more good left in this world than people think. He adjusted his bag, then turned toward the road. Take care of yourself, Clara. And remember, strength isn't about what you can take. It's about what you can give. She watched him as he began walking, his silhouette growing smaller with every step until it disappeared into the evening haze. The gas station was quiet again, but Clara felt like something had changed, like the air itself had shifted. Back on the road, somewhere in the distance, 4 bikers sat quietly, each of them thinking about a man who had shown them what real power looked like. And as the sun finally dipped below the horizon, the world felt just a little bit brighter. As Colonel Andrews walked away, his figure slowly fading into the twilight, Clara stood frozen by the door of the gas station, her eyes fixed on him. The warm glow of the setting sun bathed his back, casting long shadows on the pavement, and for a moment, he seemed more like a legend than a man, a quiet storm of strength, wisdom, and power, walking away without a word, as though he didn't need to prove anything to anyone. Clara's thoughts swirled in a way she couldn't quite explain. She had watched the entire exchange unfold, from the biker's taunts to Andrew's calm but unyielding defense. The way he'd stood there, so steady, so unmoved by their threats, was unlike anything she'd ever seen. And then, when he'd revealed who he truly was, the entire world seemed to shift. In that moment, she realized something that would stay with her forever. Strength wasn't about who you were or what you wore. It was about what you carried inside. She could still hear the way Andrews had spoken to the bikers, his voice low but commanding. I've seen things you can't even imagine, he had said, a statement that wasn't just about battles fought on foreign soil. It was a statement about life itself. The trials and scars that came with living fully, with standing up for what's right, even when the odds were against you. Clara had only known him for a few minutes, but it was enough. Enough to know that the world wasn't full of weak people. It wasn't full of the type of people who bowed to threats and let fear guide their decisions. No, it was full of those who carried silent strength, those who knew when to fight, when to stand still, and when to walk away with their heads held high. She shook her head, still trying to wrap her mind around it all. What would have happened if she had simply followed the crowd like everyone else? If she had let fear decide for her? She knew it was easy to judge someone by their appearance, to see an old man in tattered clothes and assume he was powerless. But Andrews had proved that appearances were nothing. He had shown her that true power came from the strength of character, the lessons learned from hardship, and the quiet confidence that no one could take away. Clara thought about Duke and the others. They had been so full of themselves, so quick to judge the man who was nothing more than a figure on the outskirts of their world. They had assumed he was weak, because weakness, to them, was visible. But strength, true strength, was hidden. It was quiet, almost invisible until it was needed. And when it was needed, it struck like a force of nature, leaving no room for doubt. Andrews had done just that. He had shown them all, in one swift motion, what it meant to be someone who had nothing to prove but everything to lose. Her mind drifted back to those moments in the gas station, when the bikers had tried to intimidate the colonel. She could still hear the harsh taunts, the cruel laughter. But the colonel had simply stood his ground, a man of quiet authority. He hadn't shouted. He hadn't cursed or threatened. He had just been. And in that stillness, in that moment of calm, he had become more powerful than any of them could have imagined. And yet, he had walked away. He didn't need to stay and make them suffer. He had no desire to prove anything. His actions had already spoken louder than any words ever could. He didn't need their respect. He had earned it long ago, in the battles that no one would ever know about, in the sacrifices that were made in silence. Clara looked back at the gas station as the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon. The world felt different now. Softer, maybe. Or maybe it was her perception that had changed. She had always thought that people had to fight for their place in the world, that power was earned through loud voices and force. But now, she saw that real power was often silent. It was the quiet kind of strength that comes from knowing who you are and what you stand for, no matter what the world thinks of you. She thought about herself, too. What kind of person was she? Was she someone who judged others too quickly? Did she think that the rough exterior of someone meant they were weak or less important? The truth was, she had probably made those mistakes more than once in her life. But now, she understood. She understood that no one's worth could be judged by their clothes, their appearance, or their situation. She understood that sometimes, the most powerful people were the ones who went unnoticed, the ones who carried their strength in the quietest ways. Clara stepped back inside the gas station, but her mind was still out there, with the Colonel. She could still see him walking down the road, each step slow but sure, like he was heading to someplace important. She wanted to know where he was going. She wanted to ask him so many things. But she knew that would never happen. He was a man who didn't need to share his story, a man whose journey was his own. Maybe that was part of the lesson too. Sometimes, you don't need to know everything. You just need to understand that the journey is enough, that you are enough, without ever having to prove anything to anyone. She smiled softly to herself as she watched the last hint of sunset disappear behind the hills. For the first time in a long time, she felt inspired. She felt like she had learned something she couldn't unlearn, something that would guide her for the rest of her life. The truth was simple, and it was something the world often overlooked: strength wasn't about the loudest voice or the biggest muscles. It wasn't about the things you had or the things you could take from others. It was about resilience. It was about the ability to stand in the face of adversity, to face every challenge with quiet confidence, and to walk away when you knew it was the right thing to do. Clara took a deep breath, letting the cool night air fill her lungs. There was power in this moment, power in the knowledge that she, too, could be strong in her own way. Not through force or anger, but through resilience, grace, and a steady heart. As she glanced out at the road where the Colonel had disappeared, she couldn't help but wonder how many others out there had the same quiet strength, the same wisdom. How many people did she pass by every day who could teach her the same lessons? One thing was certain. The world was full of heroes. Some of them just didn't look the way you'd expect. And those who judged by appearances? Well, they were the ones who never saw the storm coming.